Not only is it a childhood dream to run this football team, and I've got this dream to get them in the football league, I'm also trying to run it as best like a Bitcoin company.
Yep.
We were joined by your colleague Alex Cannon, who I owe him a reply to an email from a while back because there's lots of things we're still trying to do, but we are trying to operate it like not entirely on a Bitcoin standard because we can't, because we have bills to pay and players to pay, but we're trying to operate like a Bitcoin company. So working with a company like yourself is going to enable us to do things. We should probably lay it up. Tell people about Fortress and what it is you guys do.
So Fortress is a platform that allows primarily enterprises to run on the Bitcoin standard. So effectively run your business on the Bitcoin standard. And this obviously can mean many different things, right? So if we boil it down to what our vision is of a company running on a Bitcoin standard, we mean using Bitcoin as an operational currency. So if you look at the typical use cases you see in the corporate world today for Bitcoin, like the MicroStrategy model, the buy and hold, you hold it as a treasury asset and you hope that it appreciates. Or you see a lot of companies introducing Bitcoin as a payment method, as an alternative to credit cards or other payment methods. But they do so in hands-off manner where they use a third-party payment processor that settles to them in fiat. They don't actually touch Bitcoin. So when we talk about using Bitcoin as an operational currency, it can be the base unit of account for your business. You can now pay your staff in Bitcoin. You can pay your contractors. You can use it for large multinationals. You can use it for cross-border settlements. Obviously, you're holding it on the balance sheet as well, but you're using it to run your day-to-day operations for your business.
Right. I'm going to run through with you shortly how we're using Bitcoin within the football club, and then you can talk to me about how Fortress would actually help us improve things, because we've run into a few blocks here. But to benefit from Fortress, you don't need to be on 100% Bitcoin standard, right? It's just certain companies who maybe you partially use Bitcoin can benefit.
Correct. The reality is that we live in a fiat world, right? And whichever jurisdiction you're operating in, your accounting is going to be bound by that jurisdiction, and you will have to do your accounting in fiat, and you have to interact with the fiat world. So typically what we see among our customers is they have their existing fiat infrastructure, financial infrastructure, right? Be that service providers, tooling. And then when they start introducing Bitcoin, they need to have a solution that works nicely with their existing infrastructure. And that's where Fortress helps, because we, first of all, from an accounting point of view, we have what we call a fiat reference model. So we track basis down to the UTXO level for every single transaction that moves through the ecosystem. And then from that, different types of reporting can be derived. We can feed the data into the accounting system. So
we use Zero.
It's not something that we work with today, but we can look at it. And typically the way we interact with the accounting system is pretty standardized, right? So we do the journal entries, and if that's configured properly, then it should just work.
And are you seeing a growing number of enterprises starting to have this requirement beyond? I know, like you said, a lot of hold it on the treasury and hope it goes up, but are you seeing more starting to accept Bitcoin and need a system to help manage this?
Yes. The primary use case that we see driving this operational adoption is actually payroll. Or you could put it in a broader category. You can look at it as payroll and rewards programs, right? And also the creator economy. That's another area where we see adoption for Bitcoin, for paying out the royalty holders, the artists. And I suspect that's just the beginning. We obviously have among our customer base some early adopters, but we're seeing a pattern emerging there, and we're seeing larger, more traditional multinational corporations starting to do some tests for using Bitcoin as a cross-border settlement tool as well, which is very encouraging.
Interesting. Tell me more about that.
Well, effectively, if you look at the challenges, especially for multinationals that move significant volume of liquidity across international jurisdictions, the banking system can be quite so at times and quite challenging and expensive as well. So obviously Bitcoin, when you effectuate a Bitcoin transaction, that's final settlement. It can be very cheap if done properly, but also there's another significant benefit, which is typically when you're sending money in the fiat world, the money and the message arrive at different times. And what we mean by that is we're looking at use cases, right, with large corporations where they're doing thousands upon thousands of transactions a day, and ultimately funds might hit an account, but there's no metadata coming with that transaction. And then there's the challenge of reconciliation and matching all of those. Well, with Bitcoin, that's different, right? You get a transaction, final settlement, and the message arriving at the same time. And this is where Fortress helps those use cases, because we integrate with treasury management systems, ERPs, and then we can feed that data in real time. So effectively, you take reconciliation from being a challenging process to fully automating it for Bitcoin transactions.
And so for using Bitcoin to settle across borders, is that jurisdiction specific where people are finding the use case? Because I know, for example, I trade with the US because of the podcast.
Yes.
I've got sponsors there. Whenever they want to pay me, it's not too difficult. I give them my SWIFT or my IBAN numbers, and usually settlement's pretty quick. But I have had it where I worked with a guy in Japan and we couldn't find a way to connect our bank accounts. And also when I was in El Salvador, I was with somebody who was trying to send money into El Salvador from the US, and it became close to a nightmare. There were limits, IDs. It was so painful. In the end, they actually did do a Bitcoin transaction. So is it jurisdiction dependent?
It is definitely jurisdiction specific. But what's interesting about Bitcoin is once you've set up your system, it's jurisdiction agnostic.
Yes.
So you have a system that now works worldwide. In certain jurisdictions, maybe a fiat transfer makes more sense. But in most, and if you're looking at it from a global perspective, Bitcoin is definitely going to be superior for many use cases.
And are those companies just using Bitcoin to send the payment across borders? Are they then just converting it straight back to fiat, or what's the?
They're holding a position, right? They're holding Bitcoin on the balance sheet as well. But they're separating the two use cases. Mm-hmm. So that's where we look at that and basically you're classifying the use of Bitcoin depending on its intended purpose, right? And this is important not just from a use case perspective, but also from a legal compliance and tax compliance perspective as well, because the reporting requirements are going to be different for holding it when you're holding it as a treasury asset versus when you're using it as a payment asset.
Right, but could you have companies who come to you and say, listen, we've got to settle globally a number of countries, we're having difficulty with the banking system, we want to use Bitcoin to do this, but we don't want to hold Bitcoin. Is that a possibility?
It is common.
It's common.
It is common.
Yeah.
What we see is almost like an educational element to this, where typically that's what we call a hands-off approach, right? Typically, that's where when you have a company that wants to look at utilizing Bitcoin, they will take this approach first, just because they don't want to be too exposed to the price fluctuations. And that is something that we can facilitate. We have partnerships with liquidity partners that can do quick on and off ramping to be able to facilitate this. And you could even call it using Bitcoin as a network and not necessarily holding it as an asset, right? And try to minimize the exposure to price fluctuation. But what we typically see is that's just a gateway. Once they start using it, once they start learning what the benefits are, they want to hold it.
Yeah, always the way.
That doesn't mean that, as you said, right? Even your company, you live in a fiat world, you have bills to pay. That doesn't mean that they hold all the Bitcoin, right? But they can establish level of comfort that they have for exposure to price fluctuation on the treasury side, and then anything above that they can off ramp into fiat, and they can define their operational controls.
But you only support Bitcoin, right?
At the moment, so we built. It's a touchy subject.
Solana,
so
Ethereum, Dentacoin. What are you bringing?
We built this on Bitcoin. Obviously, we believe that Bitcoin is really the only truly decentralized network that can offer this kind of innovation. And that's where the volumes were, and that's where the volumes still are. But what we're seeing is with these traditional corporates moving into the space, they want to test the waters, and they want to be able to work with primarily stable coins and some ERC20 tokens as well. So we have a choice, right? We can either just ignore that, but I would draw an analogy going back to Real Bedford, right? You live in a fiat world.
Yes.
Right? You couldn't run that on Bitcoin only.
Nope.
Now, we have two choices here. We either just say, no, we're going to work with Bitcoin only and ignore everything else. And the reality is we will have to say no to potential customers who do want to educate themselves. They want to run a few tests or proof of concepts and see how it works. So the approach we've taken is we view these stable coins and ERC20 tokens in the same lens as we view fiat from an interoperability point of view.
Right.
So yes, you can run your business on the Bitcoin standard, but you will have to interoperate with fiat and potentially other tokens.
Right, because I was heading towards it because I was thinking of stable coins because when I started talking to you about my football club, one of the challenges I have at the moment is I'm essentially operating two disparate financial systems. One is a Bitcoin one and one is a fiat one, which have their own different softwares and challenges. But if I could use stable coins instead of fiat, I could, well, not instead, but use fiat stable coins rather than fiat systems, you could do it all from one system. And then that balancing sometimes between your Bitcoin and your fiat would be a lot easier.
It would help because the financial tooling that exists it's easier to repurpose it if you're just using stable coins. But obviously, I don't need to explain the challenges and the risks associated with that. But I think that's one of the key problems or key challenges in enterprise adoption of Bitcoin that Fortress solves. So if you look at take an ERP installation, right? Best case scenario, you're looking at 6 to 12 months project to get an ERP set up in an enterprise. Worst case scenario, depending on the level of customization, you're looking at something more.
So how tell people what an ERP is?
ERP is an enterprise resource planning system. So effectively, it's enterprise software that covers at its base layer accounting and financial tooling, and then it gives you governance, financial reporting, et cetera. And then depending on the industry, there are certain modules that you can layer in, like booking systems and purchasing, et cetera.
Would SAP be considered one of those?
SAP would be considered one of those. Oracle NetSuite would be another one. Mm-hmm. So effectively, it's a very involved operation to get that set up. And now if that enterprise is now looking at integrating Bitcoin into their operations, they will have a similar challenge to what you described. Now they will, if you look at the tooling that exists on the market today, they will have to run the two in a silo. And obviously that's less than optimal. And you look at the reporting side, is something as basic as getting a consolidated view of your financial positions is going to be very difficult. You will have to do that manually. So what Fortress, the approach we took, is we try to design a system that works with existing financial infrastructure. So we integrate with the likes of an SAP or an Oracle NetSuite with treasury management systems to integrate all of your Bitcoin flows into your existing financial infrastructure. So let's say you're using Kyriba as a treasury management system and you have your cash forecasting set up and all of your global reporting. Well, we can feed the Bitcoin data into that. So yes, it works differently than a stable coin. It's you have to track basis. Obviously, it brings unique advantages, but ultimately, we can still feed that data into your accounting and financial infrastructure, so you get consolidated reporting, and you don't have to deal with running two systems in parallel.